Ah, the Tsundere. An absurdly prevalent archetype even before it was given a name, this one's existed for most of anime and manga history. Properly attaining mimetic status at the turn of the millennium, it quickly became the best-known trope basis for female anime characters around the globe. Yet in spite of that incredible popularity, the sheer magnitude of this trope's proliferation has mystified many audiences, and seemingly many creators as well, who just like to crowbar these characters into their stories simply because of the popularity of the archetype without considering its narrative purpose. For us to really get to the root of the Tsundere archetype, I think it's important we also understand the Oso Nanaji Me, or childhood friend character. Even older and more prevalent than Tsundere, though less commonly addressed now and usually combined with other traits, it traditionally referred not just to a girl whom the main protagonist would have grown up around since childhood, but one who is expected to eventually end up married to him. See, in traditional small-town Japan, it would be reasonable to think that if you happen to have a boy and a girl who are about the same age and live nearby in the same village, and assuming that they too will eventually live and reproduce in this village, then they might as well be on a crash course for marriage. And since their parents will likely reinforce this notion from a young age, the kids will be well aware of this. However, while the expectation placed on the girl would be that she simply support her husband with cooking, cleaning, and child raising, the boy would be expected to locate some sense of individual purpose and get a job, which would allow him to be a care provider for his family. Ideally, he could just take up whatever job his father did, but in an ever more complex society brimming with possibility, this kid will probably either have a better use of his talents, or simply he will find the life that he's already known to be unsexy. Now, some semblance of this family dynamic is common all over the globe, and Japan has not set about wholesale rejecting it quite to the extent that America has. And it really has no need to. There's nothing inherently wrong with this system, except that it's so stridently forced onto most of society, and therefore those who don't want to participate in it find themselves othered by its prominence in media. But for many people, this could just as easily be exactly the path to a fulfilling life, and it only makes sense that media attempts to help young people navigate their way through it. Perhaps the most classical brand of anime love triangles is that of the Oso Nanaji Me versus the magical girlfriend. This was best popularized in Urusei Yatsura, a show about a dumb, young, directionless boy whose childhood friend hadn't a doubt in her mind that they would wind up married until a sexy, mysterious alien girl showed up to send shockwaves through his libido. Either of these girls could be considered a prototypical tsundere. All that either of them wants from Ataru is for him to become a mature man so that he can be a proper husband for them. But because of his selfishness and lacking sense of responsibility, he can never quite connect with them on an acceptable level of compromise. Of course, it doesn't help that neither of them is totally reasonable either, and thus a comedy of errors ensues. In her later follow-up rom-com, Ranma 1/2, Rumiko Takahashi would solidify the tsundere concept into what it resembles today, using Akane Tendo. Here is a girl suffering under unrequited love, an outright distrust of men, and an inability to be honest with her emotions because of her antagonistic relationships with most of the people around her. When she meets the female version of Ranma, she sees the opportunity for a connection which could help her through these emotional issues. But thanks to a combination of discovering that Ranma's actually a guy, some unfortunate misunderstandings, and Ranma's arrogant, egocentric attitude, she can never quite rely on him to give her the support she needs, so she violently rejects him, and this dance continues over 160 episodes. Akane's attraction to her family doctor also shows us exactly what these tsundere girls tend to be looking for. Someone mature, sensitive, and capable of understanding them. But in this case, Akane has to come to terms with the fact that she probably isn't the one that this guy needs. Other times, like in Zero no Tsukaima, the tsundere might idolize a cool older man who represents the image of what they think they want, only to realize that this image isn't necessarily representative of the person performing it. In this series, it's even more clear from the start that Saito is capable of providing Louise the support and acceptance which she so desires, but with her pride being out of control, her communication falling flat, and her needs being extreme, Saito can't see through her contentiousness enough to throw himself into being her partner, and since he uses that as an excuse to keep his options open with other girls, he perpetuates the cycle of violence and misunderstandings. Something similar happens happens between Shinji and Asuka in Evangelion. Asuka sees Kaji as the mature and understanding man who she needs, but he is totally disinterested in her as a romantic partner. She tries in so many ways to make Shinji understand that he could fulfill this role for her, but Shinji is a brick wall, so lost in himself that he can't even start to get it until the very end of the goddamn movie. So basically, the Tsundere's main thematic purpose is to ego check the main character, and this doesn't necessarily even have to be in a romantic context. Misty from Pokemon was constantly critical of Ash's egocentric mentality because she saw the legitimate potential in him to be a Pokemon master, but was frustrated with the way that his failures all came from overconfidence and an unwillingness to listen to others, which would eventually be the theme of Ash's narrative arc, but most of my generation didn't actually make it that far into the show. When the actual term tsundere properly emerged in the early 2000s though, it was more centered on the arc of a girl's slow acquiescence to sweetness towards the lead. After all, while error comedy love triangles are built to last forever, a visual novel encourages you to try and pursue each girl individually in different theoretical timelines. So eventually your protagonist will settle on the tsundere, help her through her emotional issues, and give her the love and attention she craves, and allow her space to show the sweetness in her heart which she's always guarded. Where the wires got crossed going forward from here was in the focus on the change in the girl instead of on the change in the protagonist. Instead of the guy having to change something about himself for the girl to accept him, it became that the guy can just go on being himself, and the tsundere will just eventually realize how irrational she's been for doubting him and end up going dere. We can see this in shows like The Asterisk War and Chivalry of a Failed Knight, which I talked about extensively a few years back. In both of these, the girl starts off with the same emotional roadblocks that the other tsunderes of the past exhibited, but when Mr. Perfect shows up and does everything right for them, they just get over it. At this point, one has to wonder what was even the purpose of them having tsundere attributes to begin with. In any of those prior examples, the narrative tug of war is between a guy who doesn't know how to be responsible and a girl whose expectations for him are either unreasonable or too uncompromising for the unsatisfied man to resonate with. In still other cases, such as in Ano Natsu de Mawateiru, it might even be that the guy isn't bad for the girl, but is simply so dissatisfied with his own life as it stands that he can't see the value he has in that person's eyes, and is too busy chasing after the alluring alien girl who represents the mystery of happiness which he hasn't managed to decode. But if there's nothing for the guy to learn to make the relationship work, then it just suggests that the girl was being an irrational bitch who just needed a good guy to swoop in and fix her. Perhaps these creators interpret tsundere this way because they themselves are arrogant and lacking in self-criticism, or maybe they're just awful trend-following writers. Whatever the case, the audiences often don't seem to know the difference either. In the last decade, we've watched anime rom-coms shift focus away from the male protagonist so much that they might as well not even be present. Engaged to the Unidentified is a good example of a show which just pushes the conceit of the male's involvement so far into the background that his existence is literally a joke, and pours all of its focus into following the girls. This obviously isn't a bad way to write a show per se, but when the tsundere comes to amount to just a tick in a box on a list of archetypal female characters who need to be forced into the show, it's likely they'll just be an obnoxious, domineering psycho bouncing between emotional extremes for no apparent reason. A fetishistic representation of an aesthetic crafted with no thematic purpose. And that shit sucks. Also support me on Patreon.